just begin with our starting point. So here's me facing the challenge of, and I'd just like to invite you to consider the challenges that you face at the moment. And there may be shared challenges, this larger coronavirus crisis, but also the scale of the challenge, the intensity of the challenge is unevenly distributed. Some of you may be in a much more difficult place than others. Some of you may be supporting others who are facing more difficulty. And I use a graph. I'm introducing resilience tools. This is one of the tools I use. It's called the 3 zones of challenge. And I'm going to ask you just to ask yourself, what zone am I in now? Where green is, it's a challenge that you can deal with fairly easily. You might even think of it as your comfort zone. Orange is where you feel stretched. You're outside your comfort zone, but it feels manageable. Perhaps you might even think of it as your learning edge. It's a place where you're challenged, but you often there's a steeper learning curve there. And then the red zone is where you're tipped over an edge, that you're exposed to higher levels of threat or danger. You might feel panic or overwhelm or defeated. And in any one week or any one day, we can move between different zones. But I'm just going to ask you just to think, okay, where's my starting point in this story right now? I've actually just over the last week, I've had a couple of online resilience workshops that I've been running where people say, I've been in all 3 colours in the last week, but I'm mostly here, but I've had specks of that and also some moments of that. And if you're working with others, this might be a check-in you do. If you're working as part of a team, it might be something that you check in together. Like, let's just check in where we are. How are we doing at the moment? But also for yourself in this time of challenge, when you're red, we're going to be looking at how you can respond in a way that makes the orange zones more lightly. And there's 2 ways here, and this is an important distinction about this graph, is that what zone you're in doesn't just depend on how difficult the challenge is. That there's also a vertical axis, which is about your coping capacity. And that resilience training is very much about looking at what we can do to strengthen our coping capacity, what tools we can use. But it's also about recognizing that sometimes the best resilience strategy is retreat. And it might be a strategic retreat for a period of renewal, but it might also be just stepping back from a situation that's not a good fit for us, where we're exposed to higher levels of challenge than we would choose to be. And I also want to really recognise that sometimes we don't have any choice about this, that we find ourselves in red zone situations. And so one of the pieces of work in resilience training is really to look at, even when we're at our most difficult situations, what can we do to make the best of that? And one of the things is just recognising a tool. I call it the spider diagram. I want to introduce this spider diagram. And what I mean by the spider diagram, I call it the spider diagram of radical uncertainty, is to recognise that whatever we face, it can go different ways. Whatever we face, there are different versions of it. You can be in an awful situation, but there's different versions of how that situation can develop. And when things are going well, we tend to talk about that's well-being. That I ask the question, what does it look like when things are going well? And we can ask that question of our health, our relationships, our working context, but also where resilience really comes in, or just by the way, what we're doing with the spider diagram is this is a form of flexible thinking. And in the PEN resilience program, an evidence-based resilience program that I'm very influenced by, they ask 3 perspective questions, and I want to introduce these now. They say, what's the best that can happen here? What's the worst that can happen here? And also, what's most likely to happen here? So I'm just in introducing that as a resilience tool, and you can actually use it with a hand. That colleague of mine, or someone who's been on some of my courses, Lynn, she teaches this with children, and she just uses the hand out like that and says, okay, thumbs up to what's the best, what's the worst, what's most likely. And you might think, well, what's the point of thinking about the worst? Isn't that negative thinking? And I think there's something here about, with resilience, you need to recognize risks. People are paid money to think about the worst things that can happen when there's a fire in a building. And it's from that you develop fire safety drills. And it's similar when facing any kind of challenge, but also our minds can get too focused on the worst. There's a saying in recovery groups, they say, look, don't stare. If we find ourselves staring at the worst, then it pulls us down. And that's why we need to remind ourselves that that's just one of a number of possibilities. So even when things take a turning for the worst, it's like saying, well, okay, what's the best that can happen from here? And then we're looking with resilience at how do we make the best more likely and the worst less likely. So there's a strategy here, which is remember, whatever you face, the spider diagram still holds. So even if we find ourselves in the worst situation, many of you might find that this is actually a more red zone situation than you've ever faced in your life. Certainly for me, it's the most red zone situation I've lived through, where there's been such a high level of collective anxiety and sense of threat. But even from here, it's remembering that there's different ways it can go. And I love the expression active hope. Active hope is starting where we are with our eyes open. And that's different from thinking of ourselves up here and hoping that it will all be very nice. I think it's about recalibrating our hopes so that they're reality based. It's like when things are taking a turning for the worse, let that be our starting point. But we say, from this point, how do we find a better outcome? And I think of that as active hope. Start from where you are, identify what you hope for, and then take steps to make that more likely. And that's why the second step of the storyboarding process is to ask yourself, what do you hope for here? And I have a beginning sentence. I say, what I'd like to happen here is. So facing what you face, think of the many ways it can go. What would you like to happen here? So I'm inviting you to work through this storyboard. So there you are. You have your starting point of here's you facing whatever you face, thinking what zone of challenge do you find yourself in? But then from here, what would you like to happen? And we're going to be looking at what helps you move that way. But there's very interesting research that shows that it's not just hoping for outcomes and, it's good to identify goals, but people who are realistic about the problems in the way tend to do better. I'm thinking here particularly of the research work by Gabrielle Oettingen. And this is part of the storyboard, is recognizing, well, what's in the way? Here's me. I'd love this to happen, but in the way, obstacles or difficulties include. And I want to just invite space in to name some of the difficulties you face now. Some of you might have lost your jobs. Some of you might have lost people close to you. Some of you might be feeling high levels of anxiety about whether you'll get the virus or how you'll do if you do. This is really major challenge that we face, and there might be things that you hope for that might seem impossibly far away, and we're just acknowledging this is part of the story. And I find very helpful the idea that our lives are like adventure stories, and in adventure stories there are times where everything just falls to pieces. I call them chapter 7 moments where it all seems awful, but what makes the story is our response to that.